We're going to peel back the layers of what you think you know about New Year's Eve and expose the shocking pagan origins that connect your innocent celebration to some of the darkest spiritual practices in human history. We'll trace the bloodline from ancient Babylon to your modern party, revealing how gods of death, chaos, and renewal have been worshipped through these exact same rituals for thousands of years. But before we dive into the depths of this rabbit hole, let me be clear about something. This isn't about making you feel guilty for celebrating. This is about understanding the truth behind traditions that have been sanitized and repackaged for mass consumption. Because once you see the connections, once you understand what you're really participating in, you can never look at New Year's Eve the same way again. The story begins not in Rome, not in medieval Europe, but in the cradle of civilization itself, where the first cities rose from dust and humanity first attempted to touch the divine through ritual and sacrifice.
Right, everyone, welcome to church now. Yes, we have had several commentary on what Christmas means, and a lot of people have attributed it to paganism. In fact, a particular man of God said even Easter has its origin from paganism. But of course, what are we now hearing that even celebration of New Year Eve can be attributed to paganism? I came across this video and I was startled, and I was so wondering why everything we now celebrate now seems to have a pagan origin. Now I want you to watch this. We are getting this today. We are definitely going to end this year 2025 rather, and we thank God for keeping us alive and making us see this day, the final day in the year 2025. But of course, this is my message for this year, that someone out there is saying that celebrating New Year has a pagan origin. How true is this? Let me know in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. I'll see you.
Ancient Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, where writing was invented, where laws were first codified, and where the calendar that governs your life today was born from the worship of gods whose names you've never heard, but whose influence still shapes every January 1st celebration. 4,000 years ago, in the great city of Babylon, the most important celebration of the entire year wasn't a birthday or harvest festival. It was called Akitu, and it lasted for 11 days of intense ritual designed to ensure the cosmos didn't collapse into chaos. This wasn't a party in any sense you'd recognize. This was spiritual warfare conducted through ceremony, where the fate of the entire world hung in the balance. The Babylonians understood something that modern culture has forgotten. They believed that time itself was fragile, that the transition from one year to the next was a moment of cosmic vulnerability when the forces of order and chaos battled for supremacy. During Akitu, their king would be ritually humiliated, stripped of his crown, and forced to kneel before the statue of Marduk, the chief god of their pantheon. The high priest would strike the king's face, pull his ears, and make him weep before the deity as a sign of submission to divine authority. But that was just the beginning. The real power of Akitu lay in what happened on the fourth day, when the creation myth was recited in its entirety. This wasn't storytelling for entertainment. This was magical thinking at its most potent. The Babylonians believed that by speaking the words of creation, they were actually participating in the renewal of the universe itself. They were helping their god Marduk defeat the primordial chaos monster, Tiamat, all over again, ensuring that order would triumph over destruction for another year. Here's where it gets disturbing. The climax of Akitu involved what scholars politely call sacred marriage, but what was actually a public fertility ritual performed by the king and a priestess representing the goddess Ishtar. This wasn't symbolic. This was physical union conducted before the entire population as a magical act designed to ensure the fertility of crops, animals, and humans for the coming year. The sexual act was believed to channel divine creative energy into the physical world. And if you think this sounds primitive and disconnected from modern New Year celebrations, think again. The timing, the themes, the very structure of renewal and rebirth that defines how we celebrate today can be traced directly back to these Babylonian rituals. When you make a resolution on January 1st, you're participating in the same magical thinking that drove ancient priests to believe human actions could influence cosmic forces. The Romans inherited these traditions when they conquered the known world, but they didn't just adopt them, they amplified them, systematized them, and spread them across 3 continents through the power of empire. January 1st became the Roman New Year under Julius Caesar, but the date wasn't chosen randomly. It was selected to honor Janus, a god so ancient and powerful that he predated the entire Roman pantheon. Janus was the god of beginnings and endings, of transitions and doorways, of looking backward and forward simultaneously. His 2 faces symbolized the ability to see past and future at the same moment, making him the perfect deity to oversee the turning of the year. But Janus wasn't a benevolent grandfather figure watching over calendar changes. He was a liminal god, a deity of thresholds who controlled the dangerous spaces between worlds. In Roman theology, Janus held the keys to heaven itself. No prayer could reach the gods without first passing through his approval. No beginning could commence without his blessing. And most importantly, for our story, no transition from one state of being to another could occur without invoking his power. When Romans celebrated the calends of January, they weren't just marking time. They were performing acts of worship designed to ensure Janus would allow them safe passage from one year into the next. The celebrations began at midnight danger. The Romans believed that the boundary between December 31st and January 1st was a crack in reality itself, a moment when spirits could cross between worlds and influence the fate of the living. Staying awake through this transition wasn't about partying. It was about spiritual vigilance, ensuring that malevolent forces couldn't gain a foothold in the new year while people slept. This is why Roman New Year celebrations involved loud noises, bright lights, and constant activity. The horns, the shouting, the banging of pots and pans weren't expressions of joy. They were weapons of spiritual warfare, designed to frighten away demons and evil spirits that might try to enter the world during this vulnerable moment. Every tradition you think of as celebratory was originally protective magic. The exchange of gifts during Roman New Year celebrations wasn't generosity. It was sympathetic magic, the belief that giving valuable things to others would cause valuable things to flow back to you throughout the coming year. The sweet foods, the honey cakes, the special wines weren't treats. They were offerings designed to describe them in detail. Her name was Strenia, and she was the goddess of strength, health, and new beginnings. The Latin word strena gives us the English word strenuous, but it also gives us something else that connects directly to modern New Year's traditions. Strenia's worship involved the exchange of lucky branches cut from her sacred grove. These branches, called strenae, were believed to carry the goddess's power to grant strength and good fortune. Over time, these branches evolved into other lucky gifts exchanged during New Year celebrations. But the original branches weren't just symbols. They were magical objects that had been consecrated through rituals involving blood sacrifice and sexual rites performed in Strenia's honor. The goddess herself was depicted as a young woman carrying a cornucopia and wearing a crown of evergreen branches. Her festivals involved processions of worshippers carrying torches and singing hymns that called upon her power to renew the strength of both individuals and the state. But beneath these seemingly innocent celebrations lay practices that would shock modern sensibilities. Strenia's priests maintained sacred prostitutes who were believed to channel the goddess's power through sexual union with worshippers. These weren't ordinary prostitutes. They were considered holy women whose bodies were living temples of the goddess. The money paid for their services wasn't payment for sex. It was an offering to the goddess herself, and the sexual act was considered a form of prayer that could influence the worshipper's fate for the entire coming year. The branches of Strania weren't just cut from any trees. They came from groves where human sacrifice had been performed to consecrate the ground. Ancient sources describe how criminals condemned to death would be brought to these groves during the winter solstice and ritually killed to ensure the trees would carry maximum spiritual power. Their blood was believed to feed the goddess and charge her sacred branches with the life force needed to grant wishes and protect the bearer. When Romans exchanged these branches during New Year celebrations, they weren't just sharing good luck charms. They were passing along objects that had been consecrated through human death and sexual ritual, items that carried what they believed to be genuine supernatural power. The practice was so deeply embedded in Roman culture that it continued even after Christianity became the official religion of the empire. This creates a problem that early Christian leaders struggled with for centuries. How do you tell a population that their most beloved and seemingly innocent traditions are actually acts of pagan worship? How do you explain that the New Year celebrations, bringing families together and creating joyful memories, are rooted in the veneration of gods that demanded blood sacrifice and sexual ritual? The answer, as we'll discover, was compromise. Rather than eliminate these traditions entirely, the Church chose to gradually transform them, keeping the appealing external forms while attempting to strip away the pagan spiritual content. But as we'll see in the next part of this series, this strategy was far less successful than Church leaders hoped. The spiritual power that made these traditions so attractive to ancient peoples didn't disappear just because Christian meanings were attached to them. The gods may have been renamed or forgotten, but their influence continued to flow through practices that looked harmless on the surface while carrying forward the same essential spiritual dynamics that had made them powerful for thousands of years. When you understand this historical context, modern New Year's Eve begins to look very different. Every tradition, every ritual, every moment of celebration can be traced back to these ancient attempts to manipulate supernatural forces and commune with gods whose worship involved the darkest practices humanity has ever devised. The transformation didn't happen overnight. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, Church leaders found themselves facing an impossible choice. They could either wage open war against beloved traditions that had united communities for centuries, or they could attempt something far more dangerous: spiritual alchemy. The decision they made would haunt the Church for the next 2,000 years and create the very problem we're dealing with today. Saint Augustine himself wrestled with this dilemma in his writings from the 4th century. He understood that simply banning pagan celebrations would drive them underground, making them even more spiritually dangerous. Instead, he proposed what he called baptizing the traditions, keeping their external forms while redirecting their spiritual energy toward Christian purposes. It sounded reasonable in theory. In practice, it created a hybrid monster that was neither fully pagan nor authentically Christian. The Church's first major compromise involved the timing itself. Rather than move New Year's celebrations to a completely different date, Christian leaders decided to overlay Christian meaning onto January 1st. They declared it the Feast of the Circumcision of Christ, marking the day when Jesus entered into covenant with God according to Jewish law. This gave Christians a theological reason to celebrate on the same date that pagans had been honoring Janus for centuries. But here's the problem with spiritual compromise. You can change the name of a ritual, but you can't change its essential nature. When Christians gathered on January 1st to honor Christ's circumcision, they were still participating in the same cosmic moment that pagans believed opened doorways between worlds. They were still staying awake through midnight, still making loud noises, still exchanging gifts, still performing the exact same physical actions that had been designed to invoke pagan deities. The Church Fathers convinced themselves that Christian intention could purify pagan practice. They believed that if people performed these rituals while thinking about Jesus instead of Janus, the spiritual dynamics would automatically change. This was magical thinking dressed up as theology, and it ignored a fundamental principle that ancient pagans understood instinctively. Spiritual practices have their own inherent power that operates independently of the practitioner's conscious beliefs. When you light a candle at midnight on New Year's Eve, you're not just creating light, you're participating in the same ritual structure that Roman priests used to invoke Janus. When you make noise at the stroke of 12, you're not just expressing joy, you're performing the same protective magic that pagans used to frighten away demons. When you kiss someone as the year changes, you're not just showing affection, you're engaging in the same breath-sharing ritual that was designed to magically bind fates together. The spiritual mechanics don't change just because you call them by different names or attach Christian meanings to them. This is why so many people report feeling a strange power during New Year's celebrations, even those who consider themselves completely secular. They're tapping into spiritual currents that have been flowing through these practices for thousands of years, currents that were specifically designed to connect human beings with supernatural forces. Medieval church records reveal just how unsuccessful the Christianization project really was. Year after year, church leaders issued condemnations of New Year's practices that had supposedly been transformed into Christian celebrations. In 567 CE, the Council of Tours explicitly forbade Christians from participating in January 1st festivities because they had remained too pagan in character. In 681 CE, the Council of Constantinople issued similar prohibitions. These weren't isolated incidents. For centuries, the Church was fighting a losing battle against traditions that refused to be tamed. The reason for this failure becomes clear when you examine what was actually happening during medieval New Year celebrations. Despite official Christian overlay, the essential pagan elements not only survived, but flourished. People continued to believe that the turning of the year was a moment of supernatural significance. They continued to practice divination rituals designed to predict the future. They continued to perform protective magic against evil influences. And most disturbing of all, they continued to participate in practices that can only be understood as forms of ancestor worship and communion with the dead. Medieval New Year celebrations included something called mumming, where groups of people would dress in costumes and masks to represent spirits of the dead returning to visit the living. These weren't innocent theatrical performances. They were ritual possessions, where participants believed they were actually channeling the souls of deceased ancestors. The costumes weren't decorative. They were sacred garments designed to help living people take on the spiritual essence of the dead. The mumming traditions involved house-to-house visitation, where the costumed figures would demand food, drink, and money in exchange for blessings or protection from supernatural harm. This wasn't trick-or-treating. It was spiritual extortion based on the belief that the spirits of the dead had real power to influence the fate of the living. Households that refused to provide offerings risked cursing, illness, or crop failure in the coming year. Even more disturbing were the wassailing traditions that developed around New Year celebrations. Wassailing involved groups of people visiting orchards and fields while carrying bowls of spiced ale or cider. They would pour the liquid on the roots of fruit trees while singing ancient chants designed to awaken the tree spirits and ensure good harvests. The wassailing songs weren't folk music. They were incantations, magical formulas that participants believed could actually communicate with supernatural entities inhabiting the natural world. The wassailing rituals included elements that can only be described as offerings to nature spirits. Pieces of toast soaked in cider were hung on tree branches as food for spiritual beings. Loud noises were made to frighten away evil influences that might harm the crops. And in some regions, wassailing involved the selection of a wassailing king, who would be symbolically sacrificed and reborn to ensure the fertility of the land. This symbolic sacrifice wasn't metaphorical. The wassailing king would be pelted with flour, covered in honey, and sometimes even beaten with sticks, while the crowd chanted traditional formulas. The ritual was designed to transfer the life force of the human sacrifice into the agricultural cycle, ensuring that the death and rebirth of the wassailing king would be magically replicated in the growth of crops throughout the coming year. These practices continued throughout the medieval period and well into the Renaissance, despite repeated attempts by church authorities to eliminate them. The reason they persisted was simple. They worked. Not in the sense that they actually controlled supernatural forces, but in the sense that they provided communities with a feeling of power and control over their destiny during the most vulnerable time of the year. The psychological and social functions of these rituals were so important that people were willing to risk excommunication and persecution to maintain them. The practices gave participants a sense of agency in an uncertain world, a feeling that they could influence cosmic forces through their actions. This is the same psychological dynamic that drives modern New Year's resolutions and celebrations. The external forms have been sanitized, but the underlying spiritual hunger remains unchanged. By the Renaissance, something even more troubling had occurred. Rather than eliminating pagan elements from New Year celebrations, the Church had inadvertently created a new form of folk Christianity that incorporated pagan practices as legitimate spiritual techniques. People began to believe that Christian prayers could be used to achieve the same goals that pagan rituals had been designed to accomplish. They started using holy water for protective magic, reciting Christian formulas as incantations, and treating church sacraments as magical procedures. This hybrid spirituality was neither authentically pagan nor genuinely Christian. It was a confused mixture that took the most problematic elements from both traditions, while abandoning the safeguards and theological frameworks that had kept each system coherent. The result was a form of popular religion that was spiritually dangerous precisely because it appeared to be Christian while operating according to pagan principles. Renaissance grimoires, magical textbooks that circulated throughout Europe, provide shocking evidence of how thoroughly Christian and pagan elements had become intermingled. These books contained instructions for summoning angels and demons using the same ritual techniques, for blessing objects with holy water to create protective talismans, and for using Christian prayers as magical formulas to achieve worldly goals. The New Year was considered an especially powerful time for these magical workings because the boundary between years was believed to make all spiritual practices more effective. The Protestant Reformation initially appeared to offer hope for cleaning up this spiritual mess. Reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther recognized the pagan origins of New Year celebrations and attempted to eliminate them entirely from Christian practice. Calvin wrote extensively about the diabolical superstitions that had infected the church through the adoption of pagan holidays. Luther described New Year's festivities as works of the devil that had no place in genuine Christian worship. But the Reformation created its own problems. By fragmenting Christian authority and encouraging individual interpretation of Scripture, it made coordinated resistance to pagan influences nearly impossible. Different Protestant denominations took different approaches to New Year celebrations. Some banned them entirely. Others attempted their own Christianization projects. Still others declared them matters of individual conscience. The result was even more confusion and inconsistency than had existed under unified Catholic authority. Meanwhile, the Catholic Counter-Reformation took a different approach. Rather than eliminating New Year celebrations, the Church doubled down on the Christianization strategy. They developed elaborate theological justifications for practices that had obvious pagan origins. They created new saints' feast days to overlay on traditional celebration dates. They encouraged the development of Christian folk customs that would compete with pagan traditions for popular attention. This strategy succeeded in preserving church unity, but it failed to address the fundamental spiritual problem. By the 17th century, New Year's celebrations throughout Christian Europe had become a bewildering mixture of Christian symbolism and pagan practice that satisfied no one completely. Christians who wanted pure worship found their celebrations contaminated with superstitious elements. Pagans who wanted authentic spiritual power found their traditions diluted with Christian theology. The stage was being set for the next phase of this spiritual evolution, one that would prove even more problematic than what had come before. As European colonization spread these hybrid traditions around the world, they would encounter new spiritual influences and undergo further transformations that would make their pagan origins even more difficult to detect and eliminate. The colonization of the Americas created an entirely new chapter in this spiritual contamination, one that would transform New Year's celebrations in ways that even the most astute church leaders couldn't have anticipated. When European settlers brought their hybrid Christian-pagan traditions to the New World, they encountered indigenous spiritual practices that would add another layer of complexity to an already problematic situation. Native American tribes throughout North America had their own winter solstice and New Year ceremonies, many of which involved direct communication with spiritual entities that Christian theology would classify as demonic. The Pueblo peoples performed elaborate rituals to ensure the sun's return after the longest night. The Iroquois celebrated the midwinter ceremony with sacred dances designed to maintain harmony between the human and spirit worlds. The Cherokee conducted purification rites that involved the ritual burning of personal possessions to clear away negative spiritual influences. What happened when European New Year traditions collided with these indigenous practices was a form of spiritual synthesis that created something far more dangerous than either tradition alone. Colonial records from the 17th and 18th centuries describe New Year celebrations that combined wassailing songs with Native American chants, European divination techniques with indigenous shamanic practices, and Christian prayers with rituals designed to invoke nature spirits. The Dutch settlers in New Amsterdam were particularly influential in this synthesis. They brought with them a tradition called Nieuwjaarsdag that involved house-to-house visitation, the exchange of gifts, and elaborate feasting that lasted for days. But in the colonial environment, these practices began to incorporate elements borrowed from local Native American customs. Dutch families started including corn and other indigenous foods in their New Year feasts as offerings to spirits of the land. They adopted the practice of smudging homes with burning herbs to clear away negative influences. Most significantly, they began to view the American landscape itself as spiritually active in ways that their European ancestors had never imagined. The result was a form of folk magic that treated the New World as a spiritual frontier where different types of supernatural power could be combined and experimented with. Colonial New Year celebrations became laboratories for testing hybrid spiritual techniques that drew from European paganism, Christian symbolism, and Native American shamanism all at once. The African slave trade introduced yet another spiritual dimension to this already complex mixture. Enslaved Africans brought with them sophisticated religious traditions that included elaborate New Year and ancestor veneration practices. The Yoruba tradition of honoring Elegua, the opener of ways and guardian of crossroads, had obvious parallels to Roman worship of Janus. The Congo practice of celebrating Ankisi spirits during seasonal transitions matched perfectly with European beliefs about supernatural activity during the turning of the year. But the spiritual fusion that occurred wasn't simply additive. The trauma and displacement of slavery created conditions where these different traditions merged in ways that amplified their most problematic elements. Enslaved people couldn't practice their ancestral religions openly, so they learned to hide African spiritual techniques within the forms of Christian and European folk practices. New Year celebrations became one of the primary venues for this spiritual camouflage. The result was the development of what scholars now call conjure or hoodoo traditions that treated New Year's Eve as one of the most powerful nights of the year for magical workings. These practices combined European divination techniques with African spirit communication, Christian prayer formulas with indigenous plant medicines, and pagan protective rituals with ancestral invocation ceremonies. Conjure practitioners understood something that mainstream Christianity had forgotten. Spiritual practices accumulate power over time, and the more different traditions that contribute to a ritual, the more spiritually active it becomes. New Year's Eve conjure workings were considered especially effective because they drew on the combined spiritual heritage of 3 continents.